Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's exclusive session hosted by Herdem Attorneys at Law. We are honored to have with us Mr. Dawson Law, a former OFAC and a State Department senior official and the founder of Conseil Global Advisors. Our discussion today will focus on how U.S. economic statecraft under the Trump administration is reshaping the global trade and the direct implications for Turkey. We will walk through the sanctions, export controls, tariffs, and the enforcement trends while offering compliance lessons and forward-looking strategies for Turkish companies. So I will kindly ask Dawson to introduce himself, then I will turn back to the questions. Dawson.
Great. Thank you so much, and great to be here with everybody. Thank you so much for hosting me, and it's great to be with you. I was a U.S. diplomat for over 10 years. I lived and worked in Sudan, Poland, Vietnam, and Australia, and then I subsequently was a senior advisor at OFAC, the U.S. Sanctions Authority, where I managed a number of global sanctions programs. And then subsequently, I was the U.S. Treasury representative in London, working on G7 cooperation with allies and partners, focused on many different issues, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And after leaving government last year, I founded my own consultancy where I do compliance advisory as well as geopolitical risk advisory for companies around the world, helping them kind of navigate these uncertain times with big change.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I would like to start with the Trump administration's approach. Could you please outline the key elements of the Trump administration's sanctions and export control philosophy? How does this differ from the previous approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't have to tell anyone that clearly President Trump's approach to this world is different and incredibly unpredictable in some ways. So I think first I would just start to say that the Trump administration, looks at economic tools in a fundamentally different way than previous U.S. administrations, and even frankly the first, administration under President Trump, as a highly transactional, system. So tariffs are looked at in many ways as just as easily used tool as sanctions and export controls. And so I think we're seeing that play out. Because the Trump administration highly values loyalty and they really operate in a very small circle in terms of decision making, that means that the Trump administration is not utilizing the civil service to come up with options and implement the tools they're using. So, in some ways, that's why we're seeing tariffs being used in a much bigger way than sanctions, because frankly, it takes less effort in terms of the bureaucracy to come up with those executive orders and to implement them. And so I think that's a piece of the puzzle. We do obviously see a pretty intense extraterritoriality of the Trump administration's tools. We see that the Trump administration will quickly put into place a rule. And I should just say, much of the U.S. civil service is learning about Trump's new actions via Truth Social, as they're announced there. They're not finding out in advance, and that is also the case of the UK and EU. Unlike under President Biden, where there was much more cooperation with allies and kind of information sharing to kind of get buy-in in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are some key pieces. In terms of closing of loopholes, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a moment, but with the revision of the export control bit that went out yesterday in terms of bringing in ownership and control provisions into the entity list and MEU list, that's, I think, an interesting sign that the Trump administration is wanting to close loopholes, right? And say, hey, we know people are evading U.S. export controls, and we want to change that. And so, the implementation of that will be another piece we can talk about in a moment. But that's, I think, a sign that this is only the beginning of other Trump administration steps to kind of close loopholes and to target folks. I would also just mention on the enforcement side, the Department of Justice and the U.S. administration is highly focused on drugs and cartels and immigration in the U.S. It's not clear they've dedicated a lot of resources at the moment to enforcement of sanctions, but that could change very quickly in many ways.
So, from the compliance perspective, how have these shifts changed the compliance calculus for non-US companies?
Sure. So I think obviously continuing to understand in a very deep way exposure to the U.S. dollar, to supply chains that connect up with the U.S. obviously continues to be really, really critical. To determining your risk and determining how to go about having a risk-based approach. But I think in some way the shift. I think is more fundamental when it comes to the trade of goods, right? So particularly in the tariff world, right? I think we are going to see pretty rigorous enforcement of transshipment and folks trying to evade, U.S. tariffs. I think that will be something that the Trump administration will be looking for, examples to make of foreign companies. I think the other angle there would be. The Trump administration will be looking for some really good examples to make in terms of Department of Justice investigations, but also others when it comes to drug cartels and those regulations, and also with Iran, right? Those are the key priorities of the administration, and they will be looking for enforcement opportunities in those spaces in particular. And so I think taking into account that scrutiny in those areas in particular will be really deep, I think is really critical to an approach for non-US companies.
We see that there are lots of Turkish companies as well who are listed by OFAC and the EU and recently UK. Even the EU and the UK sanctions schemes do not impose the secondary sanctions, but from the OFAC perspective, the secondary sanctions have always been a pressing concern here. So in your view, are we entering a phase of a more aggressive extraterritorial enforcement?
I think we are in a moment where that the risk is clearly there. I mean, I think for Turkey in particular, Turkey really sits in a unique position because we've seen some attention paid by President Trump to Turkey, but it has not been the kind of attention that India got, where it became square in the eye of Trump's counter Russia sanctions with the oil trade, right? Or something like that. So I think it's an interesting space that Turkey sits in at the moment. And I think, enforcement actions by this administration will probably take into account some of the geopolitical dynamics around it. By no means would I say that protects, companies in Turkey, but I think there is a context around things that's, I think, really critical to think about in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And the export controls, it has become as critical as sanctions. And could you walk us through the latest developments in semiconductors and dual-use technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think yesterday's change of the affiliate rule is really a really good example of that. We saw in congressional testimony of the nominee to head the Bureau of Industry Security that he proposed a revision to capture, more folks from the entity list and MEU listed party list. So, and so finally, the Trump administration implemented it. So, for Turkish firms, this change really means two things. You can be caught even if you're not named, right? So ownership mapping and shareholder transparency is really, really critical to understand in the context of export controls of the U.S. now. And then second, U.S. origin goods, software, and technology in your supply chain may now require licenses or could be denied altogether, if they touch a covered affiliate. And I think, to me, the immediate takeaway by the change the Trump administration made is that exporters, banks, and distributors in Turkey need to rescreen ownership structures and counterparties quickly using the 60-day transition window that the administration announced to adjust contracts and potentially restructure relationships. I think in the context of semiconductors, and this may go for export controls as well, they're being used very much in a tactical negotiation way, right? So, the move that I just talked about on ownership and control will have massive impact on Chinese companies, right? Ability to get US technology. It's hard to believe that that announcement won't be used as a bargaining chip in the context of US-China negotiations, right? For a big trade deal. And that also could be the context with, to the extent there's a big impact in Turkey, that could be wrapped up into a trade deal with Turkey as well, right? So, let's see what happens. But I think, just because it was implemented doesn't mean it couldn't change again, because the Trump administration looks at these tools as highly transactional opportunities.
Well, in this regard, I want to ask what are the top 3 red flags to monitor in the supply chains to avoid the violations for Turkish exporters and the distributors?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of red flags, I mean, you've got obviously sort of many of these are really kind of traditional ones that haven't really fundamentally changed, right? But circuitous shipments or HS code anomalies, those are obviously critical. Non-standard banks or ultimately, shell companies or indicators that there are shell companies involved. Opaque business structures are obviously huge red flags. To me, that picture hasn't changed for Turkey as a major transit point for so many goods in the world, and particularly into the Middle East and Africa. So I think that hasn't fundamentally changed, but potentially the extraterritorial consequences of running afoul of some of those I think has increased under the Trump administration in some way, for sure. Yeah.
Got the point. And we know that the Trump administration has reintroduced the idea of tariffs as a national security tool, invoking the Section 232 and the IEEPA framework. How should we interpret these measures? What is the link between the national security and the tariffs?
Sure. So, I think backing up, and I think this is a really important perspective to have on kind of how long these policies will be around and what will happen. The Trump administration looks at trade flows around the world, and particularly wants to correct what they see as this trade deficit with the United States and trade imbalance, right, where the U.S. is not manufacturing much, right? And so these tariffs are meant to correct that imbalance from a Trump administration view, right? The reality is these tariffs are bringing in a really big amount of income for the US government that will be incredibly addicting for the US government to ever get rid of, right? Even a Democratic administration would probably have a hard time getting rid of some of this revenue that is coming in based on tariffs. So I think it's fair to say that these policies, particularly around tariffs, will be here to stay for probably a long time, in some way, shape, or form. In terms of the 232 tariffs, I mean, this brings us to a bigger question, which is the Trump tariffs have been challenged in court, and there are definitely some cases which are leaning toward potentially striking down the ability of President Trump to use his executive powers, his emergency powers, under IEEPA, which probably folks are very well aware of from Sanctions, the International Emergency Powers Act, to implement tariffs. So this is a long way of saying it could be that courts will strike down President Trump's ability to implement tariffs. That said, the administration is ready for that to happen if it is to be ruled, and then we'll look to impose tariffs under 232 and other measures, which are much more cumbersome and take a lot more process, versus the process they used under IEEPA, but likely would have the same impact. So I think the downside of this is it doesn't provide much certainty to the private sector overseas in particular and in the US for long-term, decisions, right? Because you may have tariffs that will then change and change again, but depending on the legal authorities that the Trump administration can use. So I think that's where we are for now.
Yeah. And let's turn back to the Asia, and we know the India crisis has also drawn attention. And what lessons does it hold for Turkey in balancing trade diversification with the U.S. compliance exposure?
It's a really hard question. I mean, India showed us that President Trump could, despite advice from advisors that would have said, "Hey, wait a minute, this doesn't necessarily make sense," impose tariffs effectively as sanctions on India for their importation of Russian petroleum and gas. I think for Turkey, to me, it's a really key sign that that really President Trump is out for a deal, right? And so the ability for Turkey to, find ways to make some sort of a deal with President Trump to avoid some of the worst of the policies that could have the biggest impact on the Turkish economy is really critical. I say that very lightly, but I know that's incredibly complex and highly impactful on Turkish industry. And so by no means is that very simple. I think the reality, though, is President Trump could remove those tariffs on India very quickly if there was any change, right? So I think as much as that is a risk always for Turkey as such a key hub of international trade, I think this at the same time, President Trump is by no means attached to those as a long-term policy and will use them in a transactional way. So I think in that way, Turkey is really well positioned as a key international arbiter with Russia, with Ukraine, with China, with others, to use that to its advantage.
From your experience, Dawson, what are the OFAC and the Department of Justice priorities at present, and what types of cases should Turkish companies anticipate?
Yeah, so I think in terms of priorities of OFAC, their number one priority, my understanding is from talking to colleagues in Washington still is drug cartels in Latin America, right? They are highly focused on that, and I say that because I think that might be a blind spot in Europe and Turkey and beyond, right? So why should that matter? Well, the U.S. designation of Mexican and Venezuelan drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations is a big deal because that raises the bar for liability to strict liability. And you can have a subsidiary or an investment in Mexico who, let's say, is paying off cartels for the security of their buildings, or payments to use a port to cartels, indirectly going to cartels, and those payments could make you fully liable for violating the foreign terrorist authorities the U.S. has, which has extraterritorial reach, right? And so that is pretty terrifying. The case we can look back at that's really interesting is the Lafarge case under Iran sanctions, when Lafarge was a French company that was fined over $1 billion US for its payments to Iran. And that was a really good example of where the U.S. used that authority. So I can fully expect that OFAC and the Department of Justice will be looking for companies who are making payments to Mexican cartels or Venezuelan cartels and probably fully unaware of it because it's happening at such low levels, far beyond the center. That's a big risk. Beyond that, Iran is a key priority for the administration, particularly with OFAC and looking at oil transshipment and delivery of those to different ports. And then for Department of Justice, the other key priority is immigration. And that's not going to be real important for Turkish companies, but the reality is many resources have gone towards that. I think finally, you will probably see some enforcement in the export control space, but I think that will hold off until there's more clarity with where U.S. negotiations with China and other places are going. I don't see that as rolling out a lot of cases in the near term, but I think that will become a key priority at some point in the administration.
Mhm. In the meantime, I would like to ask all the attendees to drop off their questions, if any, on the Q&A box. Feel free to ask the questions. And if you were advising a Turkish corporate bank or a distributor today, what immediate compliance upgrades would you recommend?
Based on yesterday's rollout of BIS's export control, 50% ownership control rule, I cannot emphasize how important it is to understand ownership and control, in a much more nuanced way, probably, than people really thought they had to. So to me, that's probably the number one upgrade that needs to happen. Particularly to remain in compliance with export control laws, but also to make sure on the sanctions side, that you're fully aware and tracking, your compliance obligations there or risk equivalently. I think the other bit that I think is really critical for companies in Turkey is maritime compliance, right? So because of the oil price cap and because of the now differences in how the US and Europe and UK are going about implementation of that, I think there's just a lot of risk there for folks who are touching the shadow fleet. And I think I get the sense that there's an increasing sense in the US, UK, Europe, even though they're not on the same page, I think currently, that going after ship by ship with sanctions is not necessarily the most optimal solution. So there definitely will probably be a bigger look at ports and maritime service providers and others kind of in that industry to think about who's involved with the shadow fleet and how they can prevent that from happening. So that I think is going to be pretty critical.
Finally, looking into 2026, what do you foresee as the next moves of the Trump administration in sanctions, tariffs, and export controls?
Tariffs is going to be number one. We will continue, I think, to see tariffs as the fundamental tool of this administration used in many ways. Even if the courts were to override President Trump, I think we'll see that continue to be. As I said, cartels and immigration will be the other really, really big priority for this administration, which I think is not going to touch Turkey in nearly as a direct way as other issues. The other issue I would be watching very closely is the outcome of U.S. negotiations with China and whether or not there is a deal that can be reached. That, I think, is holding back a lot of actions that the U.S. might move forward with, restrictions on additional technology, revisions to its China military industrial complex list. The list goes on of various priorities there that the administration is choosing not to kind of go forward with. But that easily could change if negotiations with China either failed or if there was a deal but it wasn't implemented by China or other tensions in that space. I think also in 2026, by then we will have a little more clarity on where President Trump lands on Russia, Ukraine, and whether or not he decides to impose additional sanctions in that space to put more pressure on Russia, or if he decides to kind of deprioritize it. So I think by then we should have more clarity, and I think that will highly impact companies in Turkey in quite a big way. And then finally, I would just say, I think we're likely to see some secondary sanctions risk, particularly for financial institutions, for shipping companies, and folks in the maritime space related to Iran and related to the broader ecosystem there that I think will remain a pretty big risk for companies in Turkey.
So how should the companies in Turkey prepare their compliance framework now to stay resilient in the face of the rapid regulatory changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, understanding the ownership and control bits is really important to know your risk. I think, frankly, from the standpoint I come from, there's also a really critical point, which is to the companies that are comfortable with it having ongoing dialogue with government to better understand some of these risks, whether it be with the government of Turkey to make these risks clear so that the government of Turkey can effectively advocate with the U.S. government and potentially include big risks within the context of a trade deal. That's, I think, a big opportunity. And then in terms of broader engagement, I think the Trump administration just simply does not look at the implementation of the tools it puts into place, right? They do it, they say they're going to do it, and then they let implementation happen later. So looking at the actions, not the words, is really critical. And on the implementation side, the administration lacks a lot of detail there, and the civil service is kind of struggling to keep up. So I think to that end, if there is ambiguity or things that are uncertain, I think there is opportunity to engage government to get clarity where possible. And folks like myself and others could be very helpful in that space.
We do have a question on the Q&A box and from Anup Kumar. He says, how is the US consumer feeling right now? Are prices going up? How are they adjusting to higher costs and uncertainties?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think costs are going up, very much so, and I obviously it's very hard to predict the outcome of a potential, the congressional election in 2026. But I think many folks are talking about how Christmas will be a big test, right? How does the American consumer deal with increased prices at a time when they want to spend big, around the U.S. Christmas in December? So that'll be a big test. I think, it takes a while to see the impact of price increases. So I think we're not going to really be looking at the impact and what that means politically until into 2026. I will say the Trump administration is nimbly dealing with that, right? They are talking about giving a stimulus check money to Americans based on the tariff revenue, right? Over $1,000 for a family as a stimulus check, and that would offset some of the pain of increased prices. Perhaps politically that's very wise. A little unclear whether it really actually helps families, but it politically could be a really good idea. So let's see if they move forward with that.
Yeah. Great. If there is no question, then I will close the session. Any questions? I think there's no more question. So thank you, Dawson, for sharing these invaluable insights. And it's clear that the intersection of the sanctions, export controls, and the tariffs will continue to define global trade in the months ahead, and with significant implications for Turkey. For our audience today, whether you represent a corporate, bank, or distributor, the key takeaway is that the compliance is not static. And the frameworks must be proactive, adaptive, and prepared for swift shifts in the US policy. Yesterday's landmark decision really shows this. And thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this important dialogue. Thank you for everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.